The United States has launched 59 cruise missile strikes on Syria, targeting aircraft and other military assets. It's in retaliation for this week's abominable chemical weapons attack by the Assad regime on a rebel-held town in the country's west. The US President Donald Trump branded that action barbaric in announcing today's airstrikes, and the Australian government swiftly moved to back its ally, saying the response is just and proportionate. The Syrian army claims 6 people were killed in the airstrikes. The big questions now revolve around what happens next. Over the following hour, we'll bring you the most comprehensive analysis from around the globe. Our correspondents are standing by: Zoe Daniel in Washington, Matt Brown in Beirut and Tom Lowe in Moscow. But first, here's what happened.
The world's biggest military power unleashes its might. 59 Tomahawk missiles fired from 2 warships in the Mediterranean Sea. Their target, a Syrian airbase, said to be the launch pad for a chemical weapons attack conducted with horrific results in Idlib province this week. Less than 3 months into his presidency, Donald Trump ordered the strike, using his unchallenged authority as Commander-in-Chief of the US military.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
US officials said the missiles hit aircraft, a landing strip and fuel stations. With this decision, Donald Trump has launched the US further into the Syrian conflict than his predecessor had ever dared. The new president was motivated by Syria's own actions.
There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council.
Just last week, the Trump administration said regime change and military action like this were not a priority. But this week's events changed that. The president said these pictures had a big impact on him.
Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror.
Syrian state TV condemned what it called US aggression and repeated official denials the regime had used chemical weapons. The US action comes with immense risks. For more than a year and a half, Russia's been providing military and diplomatic support to the Assad regime. American officials said Russian forces were warned in advance of the airstrikes, and the parts of the airbase where Russians were present were not targeted. But Moscow is not happy, describing the strikes as an attack on a sovereign nation that violate international law, that'll do significant damage to US-Russia ties. And while 6 months ago the US and Russia were in talks on somehow bringing the war to an end, tonight it appears to be starting a new and dangerous phase.
And Zoe Daniel joins us now with Tom Lowe in Moscow. Tom, let's start with you. Russia was given advance warning about this missile strike, and there were no Russian planes at the targeted airfield. How's the Kremlin reacted to today's events?
Well, we've heard some very stern words from the spokesperson for Vladimir Putin. He said, first and foremost, that this was an act of aggression, an act against a sovereign state, and as such a violation of international law. He also said that as far as Moscow's concerned, Vladimir Putin's concerned, this is a distraction from the US, from civilian casualties, which have been happening in Mosul, held by Islamic State fighters in Iraq, more than 200 killed there. So, and perhaps crucially, as we look into the future, that this is a big blow to relations between Russia and the US and the two presidents who apparently have been trying to kindle some kind of relationship, but whose relation between the two countries had really been coming under pressure lately.
Well, Zoe, let me bring you in there. It is the first big foreign policy move by Donald Trump. What's been the reaction in Washington?
Look, the reaction on a bipartisan level's been broadly similar, and that is that this is proportionate to the events. So both sides of politics accepting this for the moment. I think, though, that they'll be looking for answers around whether this is part of a well-thought-out strategy by Donald Trump and his administration, or whether this is simply a gut reaction from a very mercurial president. I think members of Congress will be looking for a couple of things. One is a plan to be put to Congress for military action to get congressional approval going forward if there is to be further action. And secondly, a broad plan to address the humanitarian crisis in Syria. So this has some way to travel in terms of acceptance from here on.
Zoe Daniel-Tomlow, thank you. Today's dramatic intervention has presumably caught the Syrian government by surprise, given that until now the Trump White House has seemed loath to wade into any more foreign conflicts. The US airstrikes won't provide a quick fix for the millions of Syrian civilians forced from their homes and their nation. The humanitarian crisis extends far beyond the borders, and it's fuelled calls for the Australian government to allow more Syrians to find refuge here. The ABC's chief foreign correspondent, Philip Williams, reports.
These are the pictures that changed the president's mind. But this horror is just a tiny fraction of the violence from all sides that's forced millions to flee their homes and their country. Australia has offered safe haven for some, but not nearly enough, according to a former Australian ambassador to Syria.
I would like to see Syrians coming into Australia in larger numbers, without discrimination on the basis of their religious background, but based on their actual need, their level of vulnerability to the circumstances in which they find themselves.
There are no shortage of candidates, with nearly 5 million Syrians surviving as refugees in places like Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan. Hundreds of thousands have already made the perilous journey to Europe. For those civilians left in the many Syrian war zones, life has become an endless struggle to survive. The basics of life, food, security and medicine, in short supply or non-existent. Despite no apparent end to this crisis, Amnesty International says there are positive things Australians can do to help.
Going online, taking action, signing petitions, sharing all of these media articles that you're seeing. This is what builds a movement, a moment in time for politicians to have that political will to take action.
The need is undeniable, the end nowhere in sight. The suffering of so many will continue. Philip Williams, ABC News.
We're joined now by our Middle East correspondent, Matt Brown in Beirut. Matt, this week wasn't the first time that chemical weapons have been used during the Syrian conflict, but it is the first US military intervention in the war. What message does that send to the Assad regime?
Well, the message is clear from Donald Trump, and that is don't use chemical weapons. But, Lee, it's an incomplete message, and to that extent it raises troubling questions for the US administration and for the international community. Remember that after the horrible chemical weapons attacks in 2013, under threat of airstrikes, Bashar al-Assad agreed to declare his chemical weapons program and disarm. That went ahead. All that was declared was destroyed. But since 2014, international inspectors have raised very serious concerns that all of the chemical weapons program was not declared. That has bubbled along ever since in a little noticed controversy, and now it's come to a head with Donald Trump saying not only does Bashar al-Assad have chemical weapons, but he's used them. And that raises very serious questions about what to do now. Is the real message that following on from this, there'll be a push for more robust inspections, which Russia will almost certainly block? Or is the real message that even though this is in flagrant violation of the agreements that Syria has signed up to and its guarantor, Russia, that it's okay as long as you don't use them to have these weapons.
Philip Williams reported just a few minutes ago about the situation for civilians in Syria and what a catastrophe it is. What does this strike mean, if anything, for them?
Well, hopefully it means there will be no more chemical weapons attacks on them. But remember, after Bashar al-Assad had his declared weapons program dismantled, his military forces started using chlorine in bombs as a weapon against civilians and rebels alike. UN-appointed investigators, in a mechanism that Russia agreed to, pointed the finger squarely at the Syrian government for some of those attacks, and they've continued. And of course, most of those killed have been killed by conventional weapons. So this is a very limited strike of very limited strategic purpose and clearly not intended to change the balance on the ground.
Matt Brown, we'll come back to you for a little bit more of your analysis later in this hour. Thank you for now. The Tomahawk missiles launched at Syria are known for their deadly precision. They've been a mainstay of US warfare for more than 20 years. The ABC's defence reporter Andrew Green takes a closer look at America's sudden and dramatic military action.
On board the USS Porter 2 months ago, multiple Russian fighters aggressively buzzed the naval destroyer in the Black Sea. Now the American warship's putting Moscow on notice. It's still a force to be reckoned with after delivering a sudden strike on Syria. The strikes were launched in the early hours of the morning Syrian time. The Tomahawk land attack missiles were fired from USS Porter and another destroyer, USS Ross, in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The target was the Shayrat airfield southeast of Homs City, considered one of the largest and most active Air Force bases in Syria. The airfield is also where the US believes the Syrian regime launched its deadly chemical attack on Idlib. What was hit? Syrian jet fighters, hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum and logistical storage facilities, ammunition supply bunkers, air defence systems and radars. But chemical weapons were not. The long-range cruise missiles are designed to fly at extremely low altitudes at subsonic speeds. Carrying a 450-kilogram warhead, they're launched up to 1,600 kilometres away and are directed by GPS guidance systems to evade detection. They can also be rerouted mid-flight via satellite and don't require a pilot to be near a target. The missiles were first used in Operation Desert Storm, the combat phase of the First Gulf War, and have been a critical part of American warfare ever since. Military observers believe today's strike was both preemptive and retaliatory.
It may well be the Americans thought that another attack was about to take place, which would explain the urgency of it.
Now Australia and the world waits for the next move. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.